Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we recognize Senator Loren Legarda to speak on a matter of public interest.
Senator Loren Legarda is recognized on a question of public interest.
Thank you, Mr. President. 3 weeks ago, Typhoon Lando, or Kopu, battered Luzon provinces. It lingered over the country for a week, affecting more than 3 million Filipinos, causing damage to agriculture and infrastructure worth 11 billion pesos. With ongoing post-disaster efforts for Lando survivors, we received reports that huge amounts of disaster funds, particularly 81% of the Quick Response Funds, or the QRF, for 2015, remain unutilized, prompting your chairman of the Finance Committee to meet with agencies comprising the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council and urge them to spend disaster funds now for calamity survivals. The Department of Social Welfare and Development will utilize funds for Cash for Work programs, which usually involve clearing of debris and other rehabilitation work in affected areas. This is good, but we can expand this to other livelihood opportunities with the help of the Department of Labor and the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority. The government, particularly the Land Bank of the Philippines, should be more proactive in providing loan assistance to Lando victims, especially for farmers, because it is during the planting season. We don't want our farmers to be victims twice over, victims of natural calamity and man's greed in the form of loans from loan sharks. According to the State Weather Bureau, we are expecting 3 to 4 more typhoons before the end of the year, and this could be as strong as Lando. I hope our agencies can efficiently utilize the Quick Response Fund in the pre-positioning of basic needs and personnel in affected communities days before the typhoons arrive. There is no excuse not to be proactive because the funds are readily available in the form of the QRF and the NDREAM Fund, amounting to tens of billions of pesos, ready to be accessed by the agencies concerned. I repeat, we have to be proactive in addressing the needs of our communities, especially in reducing disaster risks and responding swiftly to post-disaster needs, as well as in adapting to and mitigating climate change. I say this, Mr. President, as we are now in the month of COP21. Towards the end of November, delegations from 196 member states of the United Nations will gather in France to negotiate for our future, and heads of state of these countries will commit or not to commit to climate action. People have asked me, what is COP21? It is the Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, the UN treaty that aims to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. This year is the 21st conference, thus it is called COP21. Parties to the UNFCCC have been negotiating for more than 2 decades. But what have we agreed on so far? Heads of state pronounce sweet promises, but the true battle is on the negotiating tables, where representatives of various government agencies agree or disagree over funding and technical support for vulnerable nations and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, among many issues. The developing countries blame the developed nations for causing global warming. Developing nations are the ones most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, while the developed countries have the responsibility and the capacity to provide assistance. COP has been, in the past years, a conference of all talk and no action. No action in the sense that the world has not done what it should have been doing the last decades to avert the climate crisis. We are now scrambling to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Why only now, when we could have started 20 years ago? Allow me to explain further the scenario now and other possible scenarios depending on our level of commitment and urgent climate action. The average global temperature has risen by 0.8 degrees Celsius since 1880. At this level, we are already experiencing, as we can see, unprecedented extreme weather events. And based on scientific studies, we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to be able to survive, because 2 degrees Celsius is clearly destructive. COP21 aims to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees. The UNFCCC has received 154 intended nationally determined contributions, or what we call the INDCs. What are these? Simply put, Mr. President, these are country commitments for reducing greenhouse gas emissions after the year 2020. But these submissions are inadequate, as the combined commitments of all these countries, as computed now, would still lead to a 2.7 degrees Celsius global warming by the year 2030. We need to do more, and certainly we cannot go business as usual. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that with a 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature in a span of 50 to 100 years, 30% of species would be at risk of extinction. According to the World Bank, it projects that even under a 2 degrees Celsius scenario, projections include a 20% decline in water availability for many regions and 15 to 20% decrease in crop yield. Moreover, with a warming of up to 2 degrees Celsius, sea level rise is projected to be around 70 centimeters. Sea level rise, floods that damage fish farms, increased acidification of the oceans by 2050 could reduce fish yield by 90%. If we reach 4 degrees Celsius warming, the IPCC further predicts, and I quote, severe and widespread impacts on unique and threatened systems, substantial species extinction, large risks to global and regional food security, the combination of high temperature and humidity compromising normal human activities. In fact, in a recent report in international media, it showed that Asia is already suffering from heat stress and heat wave because of increased warming of temperature. And this will clearly impact directly on productivity. These impacts can happen and is happening within our lifetime. We are talking about scenarios 15, 35, 85 years from now, all within this century. But we are already experiencing a near 1 degree Celsius rise. Our children, our grandchildren, their world will be very different from ours. Will we actually let them suffer, knowing now that we have the chance to avert a global crisis? We need urgent and aggressive climate action. Business as usual is not an option. Deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions is a must. Nations with the capacity and resources to aid vulnerable countries must commit their support. The COP21 agreement should define with clarity how to operationalize financing for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, technology transfer, and capacity building. The Philippines should achieve its INDC goal of 70% greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The government must commit to this and draw sectoral roadmaps that will lead us to this goal, most especially in the energy, transport, forestry, and agriculture sectors. As a developing nation, the Philippines needs more energy, but it cannot be, and I quote, "We need power at all costs, and we will develop at all costs." Some say that coal is cheap. I say coal is definitely not cheap. Coal affects our health. Coal kills biodiversity. Coal kills the environment. Coal affects our waters and pollutes the air we breathe. If we input all of these in the cost of coal, we can no longer say that coal is cheap. We are a country rich in renewable energy. The amount of sun and wind is more than enough to power our entire country many times over. We have a renewable energy law of 2008, and though we may not totally ban coal, we should have a good energy mix where there is a clear bias for renewables. This is the way Europe is going, and this is the way the world is going. I will repeat, we cannot go business as usual. It is not an option, at least if we want our children and grandchildren to live. COP21 is a crucial negotiation. But more important than the agreement is the actual action that will be taken by each nation. In closing, I wish to urge my colleagues, many of whom will be campaigning for re-election as senator, for re-election or election for higher office as president and vice president, or for local government positions. I urge you to join us to be climate advocates. Monitor the COP21 negotiations because this will affect the development agenda of the next administration. Climate change will make poverty alleviation and achieving food security increasingly difficult. New poverty traps will arise as extreme weather events becomes the new norm, and economic growth will actually slow down. We need to take urgent climate action because humanity's future depends on what we do now and what we will fail to do. Let us not make failure an option. Let us make resilience and sustainability our future. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Legarda. Senator Juan Ponce Enrile, the Minority Leader, is recognized.
Mr. President, I'm interested about this topic, and I would like to ask some questions to the lady, if she will care to answer them.
Yes, of course, Mr. President, from the most veteran and perhaps the oldest and the wisest colleague in the Senate.
Never mind about those sweet words.
Please
But
proceed,
anyway,
Senator.
thank you. What are the opposing forces in this negotiation, and why?
Who are the opposing forces
Yes.
in this negotiation?
Who and
why?
what are the opposing forces, and why?
Mr. President, it's all the nations of the world who are members of the United Nations because the UNFCCC received the commitments from all these countries, Mr. President, but clearly it is the developing nations who have committed to, and the developed nations who have committed to come up with a Green Climate Fund in 2009 in Copenhagen, but which has not operationalized this fund to assist developing nations.
Who are these developed nations in the first place?
China, India, United States, the U.S. first, and then developing China and India.
The BRICS?
Yes, Mr. President.
The BRICS?
Brazil. Yes, you remember. When you say BRICS, you're referring to Brazil, India, China, etc.
Correct.
Russia.
Yes, Mr. Russia.
And do you think you can solve this problem without the cooperation of these countries?
Oh, we need the cooperation of everyone, Mr. President. In fact,
No, I'm pointing to these countries actually.
yes,
The
Mr.
developed
President.
countries are the culprits in this.
You're correct, Mr. President. I agree with you. That is, I'm not in disagreement with you. Yes, in fact, I'm speaking in behalf of the vulnerable country that we live in, and even if we do all the mitigation, it is these countries who have polluted the world that must own up to the responsibility.
Why should the Philippines comply? And if the Philippines comply with what is required, would that solve the problem of climate change? If,
Mr. President.
If the BRICS will not cooperate?
It is not an option because they will cooperate, Mr. President. In Paris this year, there will be an ambitious climate agreement that will be reached. Mr. President, we are a non-emitter, less than 1%. I get your drift by saying that even if we mitigate, it will not create a dent in the total global greenhouse gas emissions in the world. However, what I'm saying is that we must adapt to extreme weather events. It also makes good business sense to mitigate, because mitigation as a function and adaptation serves our country well in terms of health, environment, business, and livelihood, Mr. President.
By the way, Madam, do you know how many vehicles are emitting oxides in China?
The number of vehicles I may not know, but the amount of pollution that China delivers to the world, yes, more than 20%.
How about in the Philippines? How many vehicles do we have?
I don't know the number of vehicles, Mr. President, but we are less than a 1% emitter, Mr. President.
This is the problem. This has been going on for decades, not just 2, 3, 4 years or 5 years ago. It has been going on. And for how long do you think do we have to negotiate to be able to solve this problem and reach a level of temperature that is ideal for humanity to survive?
I understand what you're saying. The Philippines may be not a major player because we are not a major emitter. It is China, the United States, India, and other countries. However, because we are the top 3 most vulnerable in the world, we must engage the world. We must make nations commit to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions so that we do not exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius for global GHG.
Well, all I can say, Madam, is good luck to you. Good luck to you.
I thank you for your wishes of good luck, Mr. President, and I hope that we see within our lifetime the developed nations who have polluted the world will commit to a less than 2 degrees Celsius of global greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Legarda, the Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we refer the speech of Senator Legarda and the interpellation thereon of Senator Enrile to the Committee on Climate Change.
So referred.
Mr. President, I move that resume, Mr. President. Move to resume.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize Senator Legarda to sponsor this measure.
Senator Legarda is recognized to sponsor the measure.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to sponsor Senate Bill number 29383 under Committee Report 284 with the permission of the Chairman of the Environment Committee, Senator Escudero. This was a bill which I filed in 1998, Mr. President, which I hope could pass before we adjourn in January. And Senator Serge Osmeña also signified his intention, and I make him a co-author and co-sponsor as a measure, as well as a chair of the Agriculture Committee, Senator Cynthia Villar. And Senator Cynthia Villar also wishes to co-author and co-sponsor this measure. Congress has a duty to pass legislation as part of its duty under Article 12, Section 12 of the Constitution. And I quote, Congress shall, as soon as possible, determine by law the specific limits of forest lands and national parks, making clearly their boundaries on the ground. Thereafter, such forest lands and national parks shall be conserved and may not be increased or diminished except by law. I wish to note that despite the absence of a law, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources has completed the delineation of the specific limits of forest lands based on Presidential Decree 705. Boundaries between permanent forests and alienable and disposable lands have been clearly marked and maintained on the ground. We have demarcated and properly identified forest lands. The national government can better plan the utilization of the natural resources of the country, and local government units will be better equipped to initiate and implement development projects and programs with due regard to the preservation and protection of the integrity of the demarcated forest lands. Mr. President, please allow me to set out the following reasons for the need to immediately pass this bill. The Forest Limits Act aims to achieve, among others, a defined forest land boundary which is expected to resolve conflict among the competing uses of forest lands, agricultural lands, and natural parks. Security of tenure through issuance of land titles to upland dwellers or actual tillers of forest lands, released or agricultural lands. Enhancement, development, administration, supervision, and protection of forest lands. Improvement of revenue collection from forest lands through the issuance of appropriate tenurial instruments and agricultural lands through collection of realty taxes. Private-public partnership in forest development. Decrease in forest degradation caused by illegal occupancy, fake and illegal titling, unlawful land use conversion, and timber poaching. Accurate information on forest limits that will help in the decision-making and planning process of proper land use in crafting a cohesive roadmap to national development, and defined forest land boundary which can be used as reference in the preparation of comprehensive land use plan or the CLUP by the LGUs as required under RA 7160 or the Local Government Code of 1991. This measure aims to achieve these targets by identifying what constitutes the forest lands, providing guidelines in determining the specific limits of forest lands, creating the National Review and Evaluation Committee, adopting an evaluation system, creating an adjudication board, and creating a congressional oversight committee to oversee the implementation of the law. It is worth stressing that the delineation of the permanent forest line is key to the establishment and implementation of a sustainable development plan for the country's forest resources. Let this measure be our lasting contribution to our children, our grandchildren, and the generations to come. On this note, I call on our colleagues in this august chamber for your support to this very important measure which operationalizes by law a major constitutional provision. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2983 under Committee Report number 284.
Suspended.
Mr. President, may I ask for a 1-minute suspension?
1 minute suspension.